Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am reviewing At Bertram's Hotel, celebrating its 60th anniversary in 2025. And as I've talked about a lot on this channel, I think this is the worst Miss Marple novel. It's universally recognized as the worst Miss Marple novel, and I don't think any other Miss Marple novel is really in the running, to be honest. Now, it is better than the worst couple of like Poirot's, and certainly better than the worst standalones, and nothing that occurred in my reread made me waver in that opinion, but maybe there were like a couple of little tiny moments that increased my appreciation for this novel. And I will say, of all the novels I ranked last in a series, this is like one of the better ones. I mean, At Bertram's Hotel is not like the bottom of the barrel, it's not in like the atrocious tier, but it has a lot of issues. And as a reminder, I will give a spoiler free summary up until the point of the murderer reveal, at which point I will warn you it's coming so you can back out if need be. Spoilers will be fair game from that point forward. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. At Bertram's Hotel begins with a description of a very important character, and it's the title character of Bertram's Hotel. The hotel takes on this role of a character, sort of, in this novel, and the descriptions and the atmosphere of Bertram's Hotel is the strongest part of this book, and perhaps it's the only strong point of the novel, but the narration takes us through a brief history of this hotel, which is still very Edwardian and old-fashioned. It survived the war with mere scratches, and despite the old-fashioned appeal, it has modernized very, very slightly, so that patrons didn't notice. There is central heating, but there are still fireplaces. There is a television, but it's hidden. In appearance, everything at Bertram's Hotel is exactly the same way it was in the 1920s and 1930s, and perhaps even earlier. One guest at the hotel is Lady Selena Hazy, and she has returned from Harley Street, which is normally code for this person's going to die, but, it's the 1960s, we're out of the golden age, so that need not apply here. Lady Selena is one of these elderly women with not a lot of money, but they get around anyway, and she is in love with the food at Bertram's, especially the muffins, which are proper English muffins, or British muffins, I should say, I guess, not English muffins as we say in the United States, and the seed cake, which is genuine seed cake. Lady Selena is an old friend of Miss Marple, who also happens to be at Bertram's Hotel. Lady Selena actually thought Miss Marple was dead, and then comments that she looks 100. Lovely of her. But Miss Marple is at Bertram's courtesy of Raymond West, of course, and his wife Joan. They actually wanted to send her someplace interesting, but no, Miss Marple wanted to go to Bertram's Hotel because she visited once when she was 14 with her uncle and aunt. And we can actually calculate Miss Marple's exact age here, since later on she says she visited in 1909, which would make her 70 years old in this novel. My dad is almost 70, so no one tell him he's almost as old as Miss Marple. Miss Marple is definitely, an old 70, not like the 70-year-olds of today. Apparently she looked 100. Bertram's is very expensive, so naturally Miss Marple cannot afford it herself, but she reunites with Lady Selena, and they talk about how old they are, progress, and another guest at Bertram's Hotel, and that would be Bess Sedwick. And Bess Sedwick is a famous adventuress of sorts. She killed some Germans during the war, climbed mountains and flew planes. She races cars. Lady Selena knew Bess Sedwick when she was a child and tells Miss Marple about her. And she's led a wild life. When she was 16, Bess ran off to marry a poor Irish man, but her parents stopped her in time, and then Bess proceeded to marry a series of rich men and divorce them. She's currently hooking up with a Polish race car driver named Ladislaus Malinowski. Bess is kind of rude to Lady Selena, and then later almost knocks Miss Marple over when the hotel commissaire opens the door for an older woman wearing an ugly hat and a younger girl of 17 or so. Bess's presence is peculiar because she's this like wilder than life person, and she feels completely out of place at Bertram's Hotel. The younger girl we had just met is Elvira Blake, and it is pronounced Elvira, not Elvira, like the Princess of Darkness. I wouldn't have known that had I not watched the adaptations a million times. But the older woman is a Mrs. Carpenter. Elvira is reunited with Colonel Derek Luscom, who is her guardian and one of the trustees of her fortune. And Elvira is completely miserable. She finds Bertram's stuffy and boring, and Colonel Luscom is boring, and they have nothing in common. And Elvira asks all these weird questions, like who gets her fortune when she dies, which Colonel Luscombe is completely creeped out by. And she also asks about her mother, but Luscombe doesn't really know where she is. And Colonel Luscombe has arranged for Elvira to stay at Bertram's, which she hates, before she goes to stay with some dreadful cousins she also hates. And Luscombe is a frequent guest at Bertram's, so he knows the staff well. There's a Miss Gering, the desk lady, and Mr. Humphreys, who either owns the hotel or is the manager. It's not initially clear, though that will be cleared up in a bit. But Mr. Humphreys tells Colonel Luscombe about how Bertram's operates. Basically, it's all a front. The hotel makes money from the rich Americans who visit London and expect the England of 1965 to be like the fantastical England they read about in books over the past decades. And since Americans expect certain things, all the modern amenities are for them. In order to keep the appearance up, the regular British customers, like Lady Selena, are charged lower prices in order to keep them coming, because most of the clients are like Lady Selena and they don't have a lot of money and they can't afford the hotel, but they are needed to keep up the appearance for the Americans. You know, the Americans expect to see decrepit aristocrats in the hotel dining room. As Elvira suffers through another conversation with Colonel Luscombe, Ladislaus Malinowski, our Polish race car driver, arrives very quickly to leave a message for Bess Sedwick. He, too, is out of place at Bertram's. There's also a Canon Pennyfather, who is a scatterbrained mess. He fits in much more at the hotel. The action then cuts to a bunch of police officers at Scotland Yard. This is really boring, but most of these people are just not important, except for Inspector Father Davey, who is also really old, hence the name Father. There's been an odd streak of crimes in the area lately involving things like bank robberies, train robberies, and the likes. The police have some leads, but nothing major, and weirdly, some important people have been seen in the area, like this judge, but like the judge also had an alibi and was somewhere else at the time, and this is all very strange, but things seem to be leading back to Bertram's Hotel in some way. We're not exactly told how or why they know that, but it is. Meanwhile, Miss Marple is enjoying her stay. Everything is just like how it was in 1909, from the food to the chambermaids to the rooms, and everything is so perfect, and she enjoys that. But that's also what unsettles her so much. It's not right that things haven't changed. Progress is supposed to happen, and in 1965, things just aren't the same as they were in like 1909 or 1935. But she enjoys the hotel nonetheless, and especially going around, shopping to all the stores and remembering what it was like in the past when she was with her aunt and her uncle. She also enjoys eavesdropping on Bess Sedwick, which she does 3 times. Once in the writing room at the hotel, when Bess Sedwick is arguing with Mickey Gorman, the hotel commissaire, or the doorman. It's not directly stated here, but it's extremely clear that Mickey Gorman is the Irishman a young Bess Sedwick nearly married until her family paid him off. He implies blackmail, and she tells him, go away. That's the polite way she says it. Miss Marple also catches Bess Sedwick having a secret meeting with Colonel Luscombe. She doesn't overhear anything here, but we are privy to this conversation as readers. Elvira is Bess Sedwick's daughter, only she wants nothing to do with Elvira because, she's a wild woman. She doesn't have time to raise a child. And she hopes Colonel Luscombe wasn't planning some kind of sentimental reunion, which she says he wasn't. Finally, Miss Marple spies Bess Sedwick at the luncheon counter at the Army-Navy store with Ladislaus Malinowski, and she tries to eavesdrop on them by pretending to forget her gloves and go back. This is something she also does in Nemesis, but the nice waitress got in the way of that, so she didn't really hear much. They did seem to be fighting about Malinowski's arrival at Bertram's and something to do with Lucerne, although Christie does not tell us which of them is going to Lucerne. We also know Canon Pennyfather is traveling to Lucerne for a religious conference. Meanwhile, Elvira Blake is up to no good. She's supposed to go to the countryside with her cousins, but she has other plans. She meets up with her friend Bridget and says she's going to Ireland because she needs to check up on something very important, only she doesn't have any money to get there, so she needs Bridget's help. While Bridget pretends to almost get hit by a car, Elvira manages to swipe a brooch or a bracelet from a jewelry store she's going to pawn. And she also has Bridget lie to allow Elvira to go to Ireland because Elvira is supposed to go to the countryside, but she tells those cousins she's staying in London for a day while telling Colonel Luscom she did go to the country. In Ireland, Elvira calls Bridget and says she found the information she sought out and it's not good news, but she never tells Bridget or us what this news was. Also, her charade in tricking everyone fell through, but she smoothed that over. Elvira even returns the bracelet she stole, which was weird to me. I mean, the jeweler knew she stole it, but just simply didn't say anything. Meanwhile, there's a lot of meanwhiles here. This plot bounces between one storyline to another. It's not very organized. But anyway, Canon Pennyfather has missed his flight to Switzerland because he didn't know what day it was. I understand being scatterbrained, but he's off an entire day. This seemed to be a little difficult for me to believe. So he's forced to go back to Bertram's after missing his conference, where he sees something shocking in his hotel room and is apparently attacked. But then we learn the Irish mail train has been robbed by bandits. A race car was heard in the vicinity, and a man who looked an awful lot like Canon Pennyfather was also seen nearby. Elvira goes to see her lawyer, who is also a trustee, and she asks him about how much money she has because she's young and no one tells her anything. And the lawyer is much more open with her than Colonel Luscombe is. He tells Elvira she's very rich because her father was wealthy, and although she did not inherit his title, his will left her everything else to his daughter Elvira, which is about £600,000, or in 2025 money, this is just under £15 million, or in US currency, about $20 million. Elvira asks this lawyer, the same question she asked Colonel Luscombe about, who inherits her money if she dies, and questions about her mother. The lawyer thinks there's a man involved, and he's proven correct because Miss Marple sees Elvira having lunch with Ladislas Malinowki, and Miss Marple recognizes Elvira as Bess Sedwick's daughter because this is Miss Marple, of course she knows. And Canon Pennyfather has not returned home, and his housekeeper is worried. Eventually, she and the Archdeacon call the hotel and the police, and the missing canon becomes the main mystery to solve. This happens, quite frankly, way too late in the novel to even have our first mystery involved. There's no hint of what the mystery is even going to be until this point. So, this is very strange and really not appropriate for a mystery novel. Inspector Father Davey gets involved and does a lot of things Miss Marple really should be doing. I don't know why Christie sidelined her so much. This work was so apt for Miss Marple to do by speaking to people at the hotel who think she'll just be a nosy old lady. But no, Father Davey does all this, and he's really boring. Miss Gering and Mr. Humphreys aren't willing to help, and Miss Gering sort of humorously sends Father Davey off to talk to a bunch of people she doesn't think will be all that helpful because she's too concerned about the hotel's reputation to want to get involved with this. And of course, one of those people is Miss Marple, so Miss Gering is wrong. But Miss Marple tells Father Davey that she actually saw Canon Pennyfather return to the hotel, or specifically what she saw was Canon Pennyfather leaving the hotel at 3 in the morning. And the reader knew Pennyfather returned to the hotel, but no one else actually had. Canon Pennyfather's luggage was still in the hotel, but the bag he brought with him to the airport is missing. And to Davey, that means someone wanted to make it look like he went to Switzerland after all, but we know he didn't. We spend the next couple of chapters with Father Davey looking into Canon Pennyfather's disappearance, and this was really boring. I don't understand why Miss Marple was completely absent from all of this. I understand why Christie, sometimes pushes Miss Marple into the background on an occasion, but it makes no sense here, and Father Davey was just so boring, and these chapters just go on and on with nothing really happening in them. But eventually, we do learn Canon Pennyfather is still alive. He was hit by a car and found on the side of the road of some village no one had ever heard of before, but this village is near where the Irish mail train was robbed. A family took the Canon in, and they didn't report his disappearance to the police because they thought he was drunk and they wanted to spare him some embarrassment. But again, Father Davey meets with the Canon, and he is just totally useless. He doesn't remember getting hit by a car. He doesn't remember what he did after he got turned away at the airport. And all Father Davey does is suspect Ladislas Malinowski of being involved because his car was seen in the vicinity of the train robbery, or at least the license plate was, or a similar license plate. It's not clear at all what was actually seen near the scene of the crime. And Father Davey thinks that, it doesn't all that matter all that much. He also thinks there's some connection with Bertram's because there's too many odd things have been going on there. And we finally see Miss Marple again. Father Davey consults her, and she's not at all concerned about Ken and Pennyfather now that he's been found. But she's very concerned about Elvira Blake because she doesn't like Ladislaus Malinowski. She thinks Elvira could be in danger, which is the perfect time for Elvira to come running into the hotel screaming that someone tried to kill her. Apparently, in the heavy London fog, a lot is made of how foggy it is in London this night. Someone apparently shot at Elvira, and then Mickey Gorman jumped in front of her to protect her, and then he got killed. So the hotel is down one Irish commissaire. Elvira runs to her mother for comfort, which is, a totally normal thing for her to do, considering she has no relationship with Bess Sedwick whatsoever, and apparently doesn't even supposed to know Bess is her mother. Elvira didn't see anything because of the fog, but she tells Davey the story about how she was in Italy, at school, and someone tried to kill her via one of my favorite tropes, poison chocolate sent from an unknown source. Amazing how this keeps happening. She thinks her boyfriend Guido might have done it, but maybe he didn't. And later, Bess tells the police that Elvira is just lying about all of this. And Bridget basically says the same thing. And Bridget also says Elvira was seeing Ladislas Malinowski. Our race car driver admits to seeing Elvira, but says he's really in love with Bess. And Elvira is just like a dumb girl he flirts with. But Father Davey suspects Ladislaus is probably after Elvira's money because Elvira had been asking, what happens if she died and what happens to her money. And the gun used to kill Mickey was Ladislaus Malinowski's. And Davey also has this idea that Elvira might be caught up in the Irish mail train because it happened when she was returning home from Ireland. But Father Davey is at a loss, so he tracks down Miss Marple, who has left Bertram's. He picks her up at Paddington Station, last seen in 450 from Paddington. Amazing that Miss Marple was at Bertram's for 2 weeks, and we saw almost none of her during that time. I have no idea why Christie had her leave only to bring her back. It makes absolutely no sense. But Father Davey brings Miss Marple to Bertram's to discuss the case. He's also brought back Ken and Pennyfather, and this is where I end the spoiler-free section, so back out now if you don't want to be spoiled. You've been warned. Miss Marple immediately recognizes that this Canon Pennyfather is not the same Canon Pennyfather she saw the night he disappeared. His walk is different. And Canon Pennyfather also remembers, suddenly out of the blue, what he saw when he returned to his hotel room after his missing flight. Himself. He saw himself in the room. And Miss Marple realizes exactly what's happening. Bertrams Hotel is a fake. It's a front for criminal activity, and almost everyone there is in on it. The staff are mostly actors hired to play the parts of the perfect chambermaid, the host who served the cake, even some of the guests. The gang of criminals would rob banks and trains while disguised as well-known, distinctive people. That way, if they were ever seen, everyone's alibi would check out because the real person would be somewhere else and be above suspicion. And all of these actors added to the atmosphere of Bertram's Hotel to attract real clients. The stolen loot would then be sold somewhere, including 2 people at Bertram's Hotel, real guests even. Miss Marple laments the downfall of Bertram's. That was a clue in itself. Bertram's hadn't changed much at all, and it should have. Things change over time because Bertram's never did. It wasn't real. It was all a front. But who is the ringleader behind this? Father Davey thinks it's Ladislas Malinowski. One can't help but to think it's for prejudicial reasons, but Miss Marple knows otherwise. The ringleader is Bess Sedwick, and she's doing all of this because she's simply bored with life and wanted something interesting to do. Bess Sedwick admits this, but she denies any involvement from Ladislaus Malinowski, but Father Davey isn't buying that. She also denies any involvement in the death of Mickey Gorman because her gang doesn't murder people. They may knock people on the head, but they don't kill anyone. And Miss Marple agrees with that, but then confronts Bess Sedwick anyway. Miss Marple knows the truth, that Mickey Gorman was married to Bess Sedwick legally. Bess always said her parents dragged her away and paid Mickey off before they got married, but that wasn't true. And Miss Marple overheard the conversation between Bess and Mickey from earlier in the novel. Father Davey says Bess killed Mickey because he was blackmailing her, but she denies that. Miss Marple steps in again to say that another person was in the public reading room at the time of that conversation, and that person also overheard them, and that person was Elvira Blake. And then Bess suddenly changes her mind and admits to killing Mickey Gorman. She said she fired one shot away from Elvira to make it look like Elvira was the target, and then she shot Mickey when he stepped in to protect Elvira. But of course, this doesn't make any sense because, as we know from the way it unfolded, Bess Sedwick was in the hotel at the time Elvira was shot at. And then we have quite possibly the most ridiculous thing to happen in a Miss Marple novel. Bess throws a telephone through a window, breaks it. She then jumps out of the window, climbs up a drain pipe, and then runs across rooftops, steals a car, and then crashes the car into a park railing and killing herself. Elvira exits the hotel, and Miss Marple and Father Davey tell her what happened and that her mother confessed to killing Mickey Gorman. And Elvira says, okay, and walks away. This angers Father Davey because, as he knows, and as Miss Marple knows, and probably the reader knows, Bess Sedwick did not kill Mickey Gorman. Elvira did. Elvira was never the target. And here's what happened. Because Mickey Gorman was legally married to Bess Sedwick, all of Bess's future marriages were bigamous, including the one to Elvira's father. Elvira was afraid that if this information came out, she would lose her inheritance because her parents were not legally married, and this is why she traveled to Ireland to confirm for herself if the marriage had actually happened. I intentionally did not mention the town of Ballygowan because it's a dead giveaway, but it is stated in the novel that's where Mickey is from, and that's where Bess ran off to, and that's where Elvira went. It's actually not mentioned till later on. That's where Elvira went, which is a bit of not playing fair. Ballygowan, by the way, is also in Northern Ireland, not Ireland. I suspect this is a historical thing. Perhaps some on the UK would know better than I would here. But Elvira wanted the money because that was the only way Malinowski was going to marry her. He was only interested in her money. And we're also told that Elvira is explicitly mentioned in her father's will by name, so it wouldn't have mattered if her parents' marriage was bigamous or not. I also believe it wouldn't have mattered anyway because I think at this point an illegitimate child could inherit from their parents, but it is possible Elvira, being young, just didn't understand that. I know some people criticize this motivation for Elvira here. I actually don't, because Elvira is portrayed as immature enough not to know that, though why didn't she ask that when she was asking all these other questions? I don't know. But the novel ends with Elvira basically getting away with it, but with Father Davey insisting he's going to try to prove it. But Miss Marple is skeptical because Miss Marple knows she's going to have to testify in court that Bess Sedwick confessed to the murder to Miss Marple, and there's very little she can do after that comes out. Praise. I have to be honest, this is such a weak entry into the Christieverse, especially the Miss Marple collection. I have so little praise for this novel. Now, I think the descriptions of Bertram's Hotel are spectacular. They are the best thing about this book. I absolutely have a great feel for not only what the hotel looks like, but what it feels like to be there and how it operates and its personality. I did come to appreciate some of the smaller clues Christie planted with the description of the hotel and how it's a front for criminal activity. We're all told the hotel is fake early on and how it's basically a scam to get money out of rich Americans, and some of the staff are just playing the role. I think that was clever of Christie, and it's something I really did not make note of until this reread. I think Christie makes some great insights about aging and societal progress. I'm really at a loss here for praise, to be honest. I don't think this book is terrible. And when I looked up contemporary reviews of it, basically they all said the same thing I said. And basically here that the plot was bad, but like Christie's writing style made it tolerable. I guess I would agree with that. I mean, this book is not boring necessarily, nor does it drag on. It's very readable, but if I'm saying that in the praise section, there's not a lot to praise here. And let's get into those issues. The plot. The plot is bad. I don't necessarily find the gang robbery stuff all that bad, but the disappearance of Canon Pennyfather is the main mystery for a bit, but then it just resolves itself uninterestingly and unceremoniously. It's not really solvable. And to be honest, discovering the ringleader of the gang is also not really solvable. There is the implication that it must be Bess Sedwick because she's out of place at Bertram's, but I mean, that's it. And the murder of Mickey Gorman is absolutely terrible. Christie often reused twists that but she always does that in a way that feels fresh and inventive, or at least entertaining. And here, she is once again using the apparent victim was the murderer all along, and it's just transparently obvious. I don't think anyone actively trying to solve this case is fooled by it. This is Christie's worst use of it, especially since she's used it a lot. This is probably her most used twist. I don't think the gang robbery plot actually even makes any sense. Like, I don't understand how dressing up as famous people helps them in any way establish an alibi. I don't get what Christie's doing here. I think the concept is interesting, but I just think it's a complete flop, though. I mean, at least it's interesting. And it's drilled in repeatedly to us that, again, that Mickey Gorman is from Ireland and Bess went to Ireland. And where is Elvira going? Ireland. We're also not told where in Ireland Elvira went until later on, which is not playing fair, although completely understandable why Christie cannot tell us this. The mechanics of the murder are not interesting. The fog does add a bit of atmosphere, but it's very apparent why there's fog present. And this murder happened way too late into the book and isn't given any depth whatsoever. It's like Christie didn't care and only cared about the thriller plot, which quite frankly wasn't that much better. I felt the plotting was uninteresting, obvious, and uncreative. We're constantly going like whiplashly back and forth between whatever Elvira's doing and whatever Pennyfather is doing, or Father Davey. It's just like complete whiplash. It lacked any passion behind it. It's not even wrapped up tightly. There are open questions like, was Ladislaus Malinowski involved in the robberies or not? Was he really after Elvira's money? We don't know. And to be constructive here, I'm so rarely constructive in these criticism sections, but what this book should have done was cut out the Mickey Gorman murder and leave the mail train robbery and the Canon Pennyfather stuff in place. Nix Miss Marple and have this be a Tommy and Tuppence. I think that works so much better. And speaking of Miss Marple, the characters in this book are awful. None of them are memorable. I know people are going to say, well, Bess Sedwick was a good character. I would disagree. I think Bess Sedwick stands out because she's the most interesting character in the novel, but she's not a good character. Elvira is probably a better character than I gave her credit for on my murderer ranking, but I think she's still pretty bad. Ladislaus Malinowski is an offensive caricature and a terrible character. Father Davey is beyond boring. Mickey Gorman is non-existent. Colonel Luscom is okay, I suppose. I mean, Christie knows how to write like an Anglo-Indian colonel. Lady Selena and Bridget were interesting, but she just vanishes. Lady Selena vanishes without explanation halfway through. I think it's telling that both the Joan Hickson BBC and the Geraldine McEwen ITV adaptations give larger roles to both Lady Selena and Bridget. I know a lot of people did not like the Geraldine McEwen ITV adaptation of this book, and quite frankly, I don't either. Though I have less problems with it than I think most people do, just because I think the original is just so bad that the ITV version at least does something. I think that's probably, necessary for them to expand these characters. And Miss Marple is pretty bad. I mean, she's absent for large chunks of the novel. And then when she is on the page, she's oddly depicted. I mean, for instance, her intuition is wrong at many points, which is extremely out of character. She thinks Elvira is in danger at one point when she's not. There are factual errors as well. Ballygowan is in Northern Ireland, not Ireland. And while I suppose this lack of distinction might be like political or timely in nature, I don't think it is, because we're told Elvira went to Ballygowan but was also near enough to be involved in the Irish mail train robbery. Elvira would be nowhere near enough to take the Irish mail train back to London when she could have just flown back to London, which is how she got to Ballygowan in the first place. And I looked this up, believe it or not, and there is a completely separate train system in Ballygowan she could have taken back to London in 1965 without having to take the mail train. And by the way, we're never even told if she took the mail train or not. We have no idea how she got back. So the plot point doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense why Elvira and Bess suddenly reunite and make up at the end. It's another one of these weird mommy issues from Christie. I guess it makes sense for Elvira since she's faking all this, but for Bess to suddenly become a warm mother is completely out of character. As much as I praise the setting and the atmosphere of the hotel, I think Christie wastes the opportunity to do something so much grander with it. I mean, this would have been a great scene to have, like, even if she kept the murder of Mickey Gorman and that was the main plot, I think just having all of these characters staying at the hotel with this atmosphere would have been so much better. It would have been almost like a country house. It would have been this urban hotel, but you get the point. And finally, I think the tone of this novel comes off as very preachy and unpleasant at times. With Miss Marple and Father Davey coming across as disciplinarians, scolding younger people in a very unpleasant way. It's very preachy and very old fogey of Christie in a way she never really is prior to this or even after this. It's very strange and it's unpleasant. All right, let's get into individual characters, starting with Miss Marple, who was not great here, as I already talked about. She did have some nice moments, in particular her reminiscing about the past and her observations about Bertrams, but that doesn't change the fact that this is such an odd book for her. Miss Marple feels so out of place in a thriller like this one. She's wrong on multiple occasions. She thinks Elvira is in danger of being harmed when she's not. Her intuition is off. She doesn't make any village parallels. And then we have to reckon with the fact that she was at Bertram's for 2 weeks and we hardly saw her at all. Like, she didn't really interact with the other characters. I mean, she had like one scene with Lady Selena, like a half a scene with Bess Sedwick. She's largely absent for most of the novel, especially when there's mystery content going on. And I understand Miss Marple and why Christie often leaves her out of the thick of things. It is Miss Marple's MO to be underestimated, and it allows her to collect information from unsuspecting people and to blend in and not assert herself. But the things Father Davey does in this book are absolutely things Miss Marple should be doing, like questioning the staff and like Miss Gering and the other guests. That would have been perfect for Miss Marple, but she doesn't do any of that. And the murder plot, there really isn't anything for her to do. Even when she is getting involved with like the robbery gang, it feels odd because this is a thriller novel and Miss Marple shouldn't be in a thriller novel. Really should not have been a Miss Marple. I think this should have been a Tommy and Tuppence. They would have been ideal for this novel, especially the one like version without the murder plot. And if Christie insisted on having the murder plot, I think Poirot probably would have been preferred. This is just such a strange Miss Marple novel. I suppose the reason why this is a Miss Marple novel is, well, first of all, Christie was getting tired of Poirot by the 60s. There's very few Poirots in the 60s, actually. But also, I think like the Bertrams Hotel setting is probably ideal for Miss Marple, but this plot is not. And we have Father Davey, and I almost never talk about like the generic police inspector, but I did want to mention this one because he's a somewhat major character, and I found him really boring and quite frankly not worthy of this main role Christie gives him. But the reason why I want to talk about him is because Christie uses him as part of her generational war, between Davey and Miss Marple on, being the older generation, with also the likes of like Colonel Luscom being there, and then we have them against the younger generation generation, like Ladislas Malinowski and Elvira and Bridget, and even like a Bess Sedwick is there. And this is very unenjoyable and awkward in the novel. It comes across as like the old generation scolding the young people. I've once heard it described as Father Davey and Miss Marple are going to go spank the child being Elvira toward the end of the novel. It's very unpleasant, completely out of character for Christie, who often doesn't come across as this old fuddy-duddy. I mean, usually she sides with the younger generation, and even her older characters are characters who recognize the younger generation have to live their lives. And, usually like the curmudgeon is like the person who gets murdered, but again, not the case here. And we have our murderer in Elvira Blake, who I thought was a terrible character. I had her at number 92 of 100 Christie killers, and that's probably too low, like just a little too low. She's mainly too low just because I have some worse characters above her. Not that my opinion of her went up any. She's supposed to be this cruel, cold-hearted young woman who's greedy and selfish, but there's something so flat and unconvincing about her. The problem is she's made out to be this awful person, this like crafty femme fatale, but she's foiled at every opportunity. She's not manipulative. Everyone sees right through her, from her mother, who doesn't even know her, Colonel Luscom, the jeweler at the store, cousin Mildred, the lawyer. They all see right through her. She's not crafty. She's not manipulative, and she comes across as pathetic, and she's not supposed to be. She is supposed to be immature, but that also makes her a pretty terrible murderer in this vein, because she could never get away with it in terms of being discovered. She is discovered, but she is going to get away with it, legally because of all the stuff Bess Sedwick is doing, which is also just a really pessimistic outlook for the future. This book is not optimistic about the time ahead. Because Elvira never gets her way until the very end when Bess Sedwick takes responsibility. She fails to rise to the level of a good murderer in control of the situation. And even Bess taking responsibility has nothing to do with what Elvira is doing. That is all on Bess, and I'll get to that soon enough. But, I did not find Elvira interesting at all. I mean, she did have one or two good moments. I think where her stealing the bracelet from the store was at least like a little entertaining, but again, I expect so much more from a murderer character. And we have our victim, Mickey Gorman, who was barely in the book. We don't know anything about him. I think we're supposed to believe he was blackmailing Bess, but we don't really know. It actually seemed to me like maybe he wasn't, and he was just toying with her in like a joking manner, having some fun. It did not appear to me that he was serious about blackmailing her. And we don't really learn enough about him for us to make any true assessment of Mickey Gorman's character. If I ranked every Christie victim, I suspect he would rank pretty low on that list. And what we did see of him felt very contradictory and in like an unintentional sort of way. Like, we're told he's a scoundrel, but then he risked his life to save Elvira. And while that may be a clue that Elvira is lying because, Mickey wouldn't do that, it did not seem like Christie wrote it that way. I do think there are like inklings of a potentially good character here, but he falls short of that. And let's get into some of the regular characters, starting with Bess Sedwick. And I know a lot of people like Bess Sedwick, and I would agree she's probably the most interesting character in the book, but I do think she falls short of the expectations set for her. I think a lot of her, popularity and how she stands out is because every other character in this novel is just worse. And she appears to be a lot better. I think the fact that she's running the robbery gang is fun. I think she does have good characterization at times. Like, I did not remember the scene where she makes a mess with the jelly donut actually occurring in the novel. I thought that was something the Joan Hickson adaptation did, but it is in the book. But there is a lot not to like here. I mean, first, Bess Sedwick is not in the novel long enough to be in the large role that she plays. She's really not in it as much as I think people think she would be. And second, her characterization is inconsistent. I'm sorry, but I am not convinced she suddenly cared enough for Elvira to take the blame and then commit suicide. She spent the entire novel avoiding and dodging Elvira, not caring about her at all. Then all of a sudden she's like, oh, Elvira, my love, and I'm going to take the blame. It's like, why would she do that? It doesn't make any sense. She's already demonstrated that she does not care about Elvira at all. So the fact that Elvira is her daughter, I don't think that really matters as much. This is just another weird mommy issues in a Christie novel. And again, you should never assume what an author writes is reflective of their own life. But this keeps coming up in Christie novels that, Christie herself was a very hands-off mother. And her daughter Rosalind often complained about this. She would complain her mother was off gallivanting here and there and spending all her time with her writing and not paying attention to her. And Christie often has a lot of these like mother characters letting their children do, weird things and going off in the world without them, and sort of to justify this. This Bess Sedwick Elvira dynamic does not work for me in this novel. It's not convincing. Then we have Canon Pennyfather, who I thought brought some humor at times with his like scatterbrained head. I did find him perhaps a bit too much of a caricature. I think it was a bit over the top just how forgetful he was. Like, I don't know how this man functions in his everyday life. He missed a plane by an entire day despite multiple characters telling him what day it was. And right before his disappearances, there's a few passages from his point of view, like he goes to like the movies and he goes to dinner, and it was like a little fun. Like, I don't think it needed to be there. I did not feel as if it like added to his character at all. I never felt like there was really a lot going on when Ken and Pennyfather here. And we have Laslas Malinowski, who I thought was a terrible character. I actually prefer the Laslas Malinowski from the ITV Marple version of this book, of this adaptation, and that's really saying something because you all know how much I do not like the ITV Marples. But, and much like Mickey Gorman, Christie sets Malinowski up for the reader to hate him, but never gives us any actual reason to do so. We're just told, like, oh, he's no good and he's a jerk, and we see nothing to make us actually believe this. And his courting of Elvira feels very contrived. I never personally felt like he was ever a villainous figure in this novel. And I think that's because we never receive any answers as to his true nature. We have no idea if he was after Elvira for her money. Was he involved in the ring of thefts? We have no idea. I'm inclined to believe not, but I mean, you could certainly think otherwise just because it's so vague. And unfortunately, I think Christie is relying a bit on his Polish and Italian nationalities to do the work to convince the reader he's a bad lot, but I think she fails to do so convincingly. I just don't buy it. And we have Colonel Derek Luscom, who I believe is the last Anglo-Indian colonel in a Christie novel that we see alive. We do have General Ravenscroft, though he's technically a general, in Elephants Can Remember, but he's dead. And we also have Boyd Carrington in Curtin, but that was written before at Bertram's Hotel. But Colonel Luscombe was fine, I guess. He has a pretty large role early on, but then he just vanishes. He's not really a suspect, and I think the setup could have been there. I mean, he just disappears. He's a trustee of Elvira's estate, and we've seen that character, be the villain quite a few times. Like, the one who's like stealing the money and has to kill to cover it up. He was the old fogey who recognized he had nothing in common with Elvira and tried to get along, but it just wasn't happening. I thought he had some decent moments, but it really wasn't anything to write home about. And we have Lady Selena Hazy, who I did actually like. I thought she was a pretty decent character, so naturally she disappeared very early on. We never really heard from her again, and I don't know why she wasn't like a companion figure for Miss Marple in this novel in the way a Dolly Bantry would be in the earlier Marple novels. She did seem to know a lot about the people at Bertram's, and she provided several clues, mostly about Bess. She really provides all the clues in the novel, to be honest. But she also had moments of her like recognizing a person only for that person to be someone else. That was a clue. I wish Lady Selena was in the novel more. I think she was needed. But then again, if Miss Marple were in the novel more, we probably wouldn't need Lady Selena at all. We have Miss Gering, who was another character who barely appeared, had a somewhat decent role, like a large size role at least, and had the potential makings of a good character, but again just comes off as forgettable. I did like the moment of her like pretending to assist Father Davey by throwing him on the guests she thinks will be useless, and because obviously she's in on the plan at Bertram's, another one of these like efficient secretary creations of Christie, although again this one felt short of expectations and potential. Almost all of the other secretary, she's technically a receptionist at the hotel, but all the other versions of this character from Christie are better, which leaves Miss Gering pretty unmemorable and a pretty lousy character. And finally, we have Elvira's friend Bridget, who, again, I thought was a potentially good character. She actually is in it quite a bit, and she does provide a lot of fun. Like, she's always, like, trying to lie to her mother about what Elvira is doing because she's covering for Elvira, and she's lying to, like, the Elvira's cousins, and she just gets like caught up on a lot of the shenanigans that Elvira is doing, like pretending to get hit by a car and all of that. I think Bridget was a pretty fun character, though she didn't really play any role in the plot, either of the two plots or the solution of it. But again, that's to be expected. I don't think she necessarily needed to be. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about At Bertram's Hotel and what you thought about my review. I do actually have seen quite a few comments from people liking this novel. I think it's easier to like because it's Miss Marple. I know Miss Marple is very popular, though to be honest, I think Miss Marple deserved better than this novel. Again, I do not like this novel. I do think a lot of people recognize this is not a good novel, but they could enjoy it anyway. Again, it's not atrociously bad. But next week, I am back covering a subgenre deep dive, this time with one of my favorite subgenres, a mystery novel. And quite frankly, it is the subgenre I think is the most difficult to write, the hardest to pull off, and that is the inverted mystery. And I will get into what the inverted mystery is, the different types of inverted mysteries, and why it's so difficult to pull off next week. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.